Okay, picture this. You're sitting around a table, right? The aroma of that roasting turkey, it's just filling the air, and you're just about to like dig into this amazing Thanksgiving feast. But have you ever actually like stopped to wonder how this whole tradition, this whole holiday that we all kind of take for granted, how it actually came to be?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's one of those things you don't think about, But when you actually start digging into it, it leads down this like fascinating path, a path that reveals a lot more about American history and culture than I think most people would expect.
It's true. And I think what's really fascinating to me is like pinning down exactly way on and how Thanksgiving became a holiday in the US. It's way more complicated than you'd think.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple story. Most people associate Thanksgiving with that iconic image, right? The Pilgrims and the Native Americans all sharing this big feast back in 1621. But honestly, that's just like a tiny little piece of this much bigger puzzle.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. If that 1621 gathering wasn't like the actual start, where do we even begin? Where does this whole thing actually start?
Well, even though that 1621 feast is often kind of held up as this origin story, the whole concept of Thanksgiving celebrations, feasts of thanks, they actually go back even further. I mean, there are accounts of Spanish and English settlers holding feasts, like feasts of thanks in the 16th and 17th
Oh,
centuries.
wow. So these early Thanksgivings were happening long before the United States even existed as a country.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that a lot of these early celebrations, they often had religious undertones, like they were expressing gratitude for things like safe journeys, successful harvests, or, other blessings.
It's important to remember, though, right, that this whole narrative, this kind of like warm and fuzzy image of early Thanksgivings, it often overshadows a much darker reality.
Oh, absolutely. We can't forget that the arrival of European colonists had pretty devastating consequences for the indigenous populations. Things like displacement, disease, violence. It's a really important part of the story.
That's such a crucial point. It's essential to understand the full context, both the good and the not so good when we talk about Thanksgiving's origin. So how do we actually get from these early kind of scattered celebrations to the Thanksgiving we know today? How does that evolution happen?
Well, let me tell you, the journey takes some really surprising twists and turns. In fact, there's even this one presidential decision that caused a national uproar. And get this, some folks even compared him to, wait for it, Hitler.
Hold on, comparing a Thanksgiving decision to Hitler? That sounds pretty intense. What in the world happened?
We'll get there, I promise. But first, let's trace the steps, kind of lay the groundwork. So the first official like national Thanksgiving wasn't until 1777. It was declared by the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. A
Yep.
time for national unity,
Yeah.
expressing gratitude for victories against the British.
Exactly. And it kind of set this precedent for Thanksgiving proclamations, often coinciding with periods of war or unrest. It's almost like seeking divine favor during challenging times, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation. It suggests that Thanksgiving, from its earliest days as like a national observance, was really tied to these broader anxieties and hopes of this young nation facing so much uncertainty.
Sure.
So was it celebrated every year at that point? Was it like an annual thing?
Not quite. It wasn't really until the 1800s that the idea of a fixed annual Thanksgiving truly took hold. And even then, believe it or not, it wasn't without its own controversies.
Okay, so who was the driving force behind making Thanksgiving the annual holiday we all know today? Whose idea was this?
That would be Sarah Jessica Hale, a very prominent magazine editor. She really championed the idea.
Hmm, interesting. What was it about Thanksgiving that appealed to her so strongly? What was she seeing in it?
Well, she saw it as this way to unify the nation,
Yeah.
especially with all the growing divisions over slavery at the time. And in her writing, she often depicted Thanksgiving as this time for families to come together, regardless of their differences, to appreciate the blessings they shared, to really connect.
So she was envisioning Thanksgiving as this unifying force, a way to bridge those divides and really strengthen the fabric of American society.
Exactly. And her vision really resonated with people. She wrote countless letters, to presidents, politicians, anyone who would listen, really advocating for this fixed annual Thanksgiving holiday. And finally, in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation establishing Thanksgiving on the last Thursday in November.
So Lincoln's proclamation during the Civil War, it really solidified Thanksgiving's place on the calendar, right? It made it
Yeah.
official.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. It formalized what Hale had been advocating for decades and really helped cement Thanksgiving as this national tradition. But as I mentioned earlier, there were still some pretty dramatic twists and turns to come, even after Lincoln's proclamation.
Okay, you've definitely got me hooked.
Yep.
Let's talk about this presidential decision that caused such a stir. Who was it and what did they do? What was the big deal?
Well, it all involves President Franklin D. Roosevelt and a decision made during one of the most challenging periods in American history, the Great Depression.
The Great Depression, huh? That's interesting. So how does Thanksgiving fit into that picture? I'm really curious about this.
Well, you see, in 1939, with the country still struggling, reeling from the economic devastation of the Depression, FDR decided to move Thanksgiving. He actually moved it a week earlier than usual. His thinking was, give retailers an extra week of shopping between Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? He figured it would boost the economy and maybe, help lift people's spirits a little bit, kind of give them something to look forward to.
Yeah, I can see the logic there. But I mean, was everyone on board with this plan? I got to imagine not everyone was thrilled about this.
Well, you are so right. Far from it, actually. FDR's decision, it sparked a nationwide controversy. And I'm not talking just like messed up calendars. This was a big deal.
Wow. So what was it about this Franksgiving? Is that what they called it?
Yeah.
What was it about that caused such an uproar? What was the big issue?
Well, for one thing, it really disrupted traditions, family plans, things that had been in place for a long time. And remember, this was back when travel was much more difficult and expensive. So moving Thanksgiving, even by a single week, really threw a wrench into a lot of people's arrangements.
Yeah, I bet. But it sounds like there was more to it than just logistical inconveniences, right? There had to be something deeper going on.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about logistics. People felt like FDR was, I don't know, messing with something sacred, like he was tampering with something deeply ingrained in American culture. This holiday that symbolized family, tradition, and national unity. It was a big deal to folks.
So it wasn't just about the date on the calendar. It was about the values and emotions tied to that date, right?
Yeah.
Like what it represented for people.
Exactly. And don't forget, this was the Great Depression, a time of just immense hardship and uncertainty. People were looking for any kind of stability, anything familiar, and, Thanksgiving provided that. It was something they could count on.
So changing the date, even for what seemed like practical, even good reasons, it felt like a violation of something, I don't know, almost sacred. Like he was overstepping his bounds.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the backlash. Intense. Newspapers were just flooded with opinions, both for and against the move. Some people, they praised FDR, said he was trying to help the economy. Others, well, they accused him of, I don't know, overstepping his authority, disrespecting tradition. It was very divided.
It's amazing to me how, like, a decision that was intended to bring some economic relief, it actually kind of exposed some really deep divisions within American society. But what really surprised me was that some people even went so far as to compare FDR to Hitler. Like, how does Thanksgiving even get to that level?
Right. I know that comparison was definitely extreme. And it really shows you just how intense the emotions were around this holiday. But keep in mind, this was also a time when fascism was on the rise in Europe, and people were understandably anxious about anything that even looked like a threat to democracy, to their individual freedoms.
So even something as simple as changing the date of Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
you're saying that could be seen through this lens of political anxiety. That's wild.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even our most cherished traditions, they can get tangled up in these broader social and political currents. It's all connected.
Okay, so if people were so upset about Thanksgiving, how did this whole thing get resolved? Did we just keep bouncing back and forth between these two dates? Like, what happened?
Well, for a few years, it was a mess, let me tell you. Some states, they flat out refused to recognize FDR's new date and just stuck with the traditional last Thursday. Others, well, they followed the president's lead. Can you imagine the confusion? Especially for families with, people living in different states.
Well, I bet it was a logistical nightmare for those folks trying to coordinate Thanksgiving gatherings.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
You can say that again. And this wasn't just families either. It was affecting businesses, schools, sports schedules. I mean, practically every aspect of American life was touched by this.
So it wasn't just like a family squabble, right? This was like a national headache. That's crazy.
Exactly. And it went on like this until 1941. That's when Congress finally stepped in and said, all right, enough's enough. We got to settle this.
Okay, so what did they decide? Did they side with FDR or did they go back to the original date? What happened?
Well, they went for a compromise. They passed a resolution that officially established Thanksgiving as a legal holiday on the fourth Thursday in November.
Ah, okay. So that explains why Thanksgiving is sometimes, you know, a bit earlier in November. It all gets back to this whole FDR thing. But I'm still kind of curious about those early Thanksgiving celebrations,
Yeah.
the ones before it became this standardized annual event. What were those actually like? I mean, did people dress up?
Well, we talked about that 1621 feast, right? That one's often held up as a model, but in reality, it was a very unique event shaped by very specific circumstances. Those early Thanksgivings were actually much more diverse in their timing and their focus.
So we're talking about Thanksgiving celebrations before it became like an annual holiday on a set date, like whenever people felt like it.
Exactly. Remember, those very first Thanksgiving proclamations back during the Revolutionary War, those were all about celebrating victories, thanking God for supporting the colonial cause. That was the whole point.
So it was more about acknowledging these specific events, right?
Yeah.
Like those military wins.
Exactly. And this theme, it kind of continued even with the later Thanksgiving proclamations. They often mentioned things like the end of wars, successful harvests, or just overcoming some kind of national challenge. It was about being thankful for those specific things.
It sounds like those early Thanksgivings were, I don't know, more closely tied to like the nation's immediate circumstances, almost like a collective sigh of relief or maybe a moment of national unity during uncertain times.
You got it. It wasn't so much about, the turkey and the football as it was about acknowledging the ups and downs of actually building a new nation and finding reasons to be grateful in the midst of all the challenges. What's really interesting to me is that it wasn't just about celebrating the good times, It was about finding strength and hope during those really difficult periods.
Yeah, the resilience. That seems like a key part of the Thanksgiving story, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it speaks to the evolving nature of the holiday. Remember Sarah Josepha Hale, the magazine editor we talked about earlier, the one who really pushed for Thanksgiving?
Yeah, the woman who really wanted a fixed annual Thanksgiving.
Right. Well, she viewed Thanksgiving as a way to bring the country together, especially with all the division over slavery. She thought it could really help heal the nation.
So even back then, people were recognizing Thanksgiving's potential as this unifying force, this thing that could bring people together.
Exactly. And that idea, it's still relevant today. Think about how, despite all our differences, people all over the country, they still gather for Thanksgiving meals. It's this time when ideally we put aside our disagreements and just focus on what we have in common.
It's true. Even with all the family drama that seems to inevitably come up, there's something about Thanksgiving that really encourages us to connect with those we love and appreciate the good things. But I'm still curious about those early Thanksgiving meals, What were those like? Were they formal gatherings, potlucks? What did people actually eat?
That's where those historical accounts get really interesting. Remember that 1621 feast we talked about, the one
Yeah.
with the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag?
Yeah.
Well, while it wasn't actually called Thanksgiving at the time, it gives us some clues about what those early celebrations might have been like. And the menu, very different from what we consider traditional today.
Really? So no turkey and stuffing. What did they eat?
Well, there might have been wild turkey, but the account suggests that the meal was more focused on what was plentiful at the time, so things like venison, duck, fish, lobster, squash, corn. They even had eel.
Eel. Wow, that's not exactly a staple on modern Thanksgiving tables.
Right. It just shows you how much those Thanksgiving menus have adapted,
Mm.
to regional differences, available ingredients, all of that.
So there wasn't this set menu. It was more about, make the most of what you have, share it with others,
Hmm.
and be grateful.
Exactly. What mattered was that focus on sharing a bountiful meal and expressing gratitude. That was the heart of it.
Okay, so how did we go from eel and venison to the Thanksgiving staples we know today?
Mm.
Was there like a specific moment when turkey became the go-to dish? Like, how did that happen?
It's actually a little unclear. Turkeys were native to North America, so they were definitely being eaten, but their rise to Thanksgiving prominence was a pretty gradual process. It wasn't like an overnight thing.
So there wasn't like a single moment where everyone was like, turkey, that's the ultimate Thanksgiving food.
Not really. It seems like it started gaining popularity in the 1800s, and some people think that Sarah Josepha Hale might have had something to do with it. She often mentioned roast turkey in her writings about Thanksgiving.
Oh, so she was a turkey fan.
That's funny. It seems so. And as Thanksgiving became more more standardized, more widespread roast turkey, well, it kind of became this symbolic centerpiece of the meal.
It makes sense, right? I mean, it's a large bird, perfect for feeding a whole crowd, and visually, it's pretty impressive on the table.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that even today, there's no like one-size-fits-all Thanksgiving menu. There are all kinds of regional variations out there, reflecting different cultural traditions, family recipes. It's really diverse.
That's so true. Every family seems to have their own, unique twists on those classic dishes.
Yeah.
That's part of what makes Thanksgiving so special, right? It's that blending of tradition and personal touches.
I agree. And those personalized traditions are often what make the strongest memories. Think about the dishes that always show up on your family's Thanksgiving table, the ones you can always count on.
Oh, definitely. My grandmother's cranberry sauce, my aunt's sweet potato casserole, those are non-negotiable.
See, those dishes become part of your family's Thanksgiving story, right? And as those traditions get passed down, they contribute to this ever-evolving narrative of this fascinating holiday. It just keeps changing.
So we've gone from these early celebrations that were tied to specific events to this more standardized annual holiday with its own set of traditions. But it's interesting that those core themes, gratitude, community, and resilience, those seem to have stayed pretty consistent throughout Thanksgiving's evolution.
That's a great point, and it's something worth reflecting on, as we gather with loved ones for Thanksgiving. But hey, let's not forget about that whole Franksgiving controversy. I'm actually really curious about the long-term impacts of FDR's decision. Like, did it have a lasting effect? That's where it gets really interesting. It's kind of amazing to think about, right? That something like changing a date could cause such a huge national debate. It really goes to show you how deeply Thanksgiving is embedded in like the fabric of American culture.
It really does. And what's so fascinating to me is that FDR's decision, even though it was, meant to boost the economy, it actually ended up highlighting like the cultural significance of Thanksgiving. It showed just how much this holiday actually meant to people, even during, all the struggles of the Great Depression.
Right. It's like he accidentally, revealed how deeply rooted this tradition was in everyone's lives. They weren't just upset about like, messed up calendars and football games being moved. They were reacting to this disruption of something truly meaningful, almost like he tampered with a sacred cow.
That is such a great analogy. It's true. And the fact that it sparked this, nationwide debate, it really says a lot about Thanksgiving's place in the American psyche. It's a good reminder that even small changes, even seemingly insignificant ones, can actually expose these deeper societal values and anxieties.
Exactly. So yeah, beyond all the immediate chaos, what were the actual long-term impacts of Thanksgiving? Like, did it change how we celebrate Thanksgiving today?
That's what I'm curious about. Did it have a lasting effect?
It definitely did. It really contributed to this push for a standardized date, which eventually led to that 1941 congressional resolution that we talked about, the one that set Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday in November.
So in a way, Thanksgiving actually helps solidify Thanksgiving's place on the calendar. That's ironic.
It is, isn't it? Kind of ironic, yeah. It forced this national conversation about the holiday's importance and ultimately led to a more definitive, solution. Even though, to be fair, some states did continue to celebrate on different dates for a few years after that resolution was passed.
That's right. It's amazing to think about how resistant cultural traditions can be to change, even when there's like, official legislation involved. It really shows you the power of those traditions and how they're passed down and become such a core part of our lives.
Absolutely. And Thanksgiving, with its focus on family and food and the shared history, it's particularly rich in those traditions. No wonder people were so attached to that specific date and all the rituals that went along with it.
It's interesting to think about how those few years of Thanksgiving really created this ripple effect, right? Shaping not only, the date of the holiday, but also sparking these broader conversations about its cultural significance.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how traditions, even the ones we think of as, timeless and unchanging, are constantly evolving. They're shaped by social forces, political events, even economic pressures.
It's true.
Cool.
So I guess next time we're all gathered around the Thanksgiving table, amidst that aroma of roasting turkey and all the chatter of loved ones, maybe we can take a minute to appreciate the long and winding journey that this holiday has taken to get to our plates.
It really is a journey. It reflects the complexities of American history and the resilience of our traditions and that that enduring power of gratitude and community and connection. That's what it's all about.
And who knows, maybe in 100 years, people will be looking back on our current Thanksgiving traditions with that same curiosity and fascination, wondering why we were so obsessed with cranberry sauce or pumpkin pie.
Or why we put up with all that family drama just for a plate of turkey. But in all seriousness, this deep dive into Thanksgiving history has been really, really fascinating. It's just amazing to see how this holiday has evolved over time, reflecting the changing landscape of our nation.
Yeah. It's a great reminder that even our most cherished traditions have a history, a story to tell. And understanding that story can really enrich our appreciation for the present and spark our curiosity about the future. Makes you think.
It does make you wonder, what will Thanksgiving look like in 100 years? What will it become?
Well, we can't predict the future, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure: as long as there are people who value gratitude and community and that simple joy of sharing a meal with loved ones, Thanksgiving in some form or another will continue to have a place at our tables.
I love that. That's a really beautiful thought. And on that note, I guess we'll wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating history of Thanksgiving. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss out on future episodes where we'll uncover the hidden stories behind all the things we often take for granted.